The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Ha-Joon Kim adjusted his black robes and looked down at the papers on his desk. His face showed no emotion, but inside, his mind was already made up about the case before him. Dr. Michelle Park stood straight and calm at the defendant's table. Her dark suit was perfectly pressed, and her hands were folded neatly in front of her. She had spent 15 years building her career as a neurosurgeon, saving countless lives with her skilled hands. Now, she faced accusations of medical negligence that could destroy everything she had worked for. The court will now hear the case of State versus Dr. Michelle Park, Judge Kim announced, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. He spoke each word slowly, letting them hang in the air like heavy clouds before a storm. Behind Dr. Park sat her colleague and friend, Dr. Ji-Woo Lee, the chief of surgery at Central Hospital. Dr. Lee had worked with Dr. Park for 7 years and knew her to be one of the most careful and skilled surgeons in the state. She watched the proceedings with growing concern, noticing how Judge Kim's eyes never quite met Dr. Park's gaze. The prosecutor stood up, a tall man with graying hair. "Your Honor, we are here today because Dr. Park's negligence during a routine surgery resulted in complications for the patient." Dr. Park's lawyer, Mr. David Chen, quickly rose to his feet. "Your Honor, we have clear evidence that the complications were due to an undiagnosed condition in the patient, something no doctor could have predicted. Dr. Park's actions during surgery actually saved the patient's life." Judge Kim barely glanced at the stack of evidence Mr. Chen had submitted. These papers included statements from 5 other doctors, all confirming that Dr. Park had followed every proper procedure. There were also medical records showing that the patient's unexpected condition was genetic and impossible to detect before surgery. As the morning went on, witness after witness spoke in Dr. Park's favor. Her nurse described how Dr. Park had noticed the first signs of trouble and responded faster than any other surgeon might have. A medical expert explained how her quick thinking had prevented a tragedy. Even the patient's family members testified that they didn't blame Dr. Park and were grateful for her care. But Judge Kim's expression grew darker with each testimony. He had seen many cases in his 30 years on the bench, and he had developed what he called instincts about people. In truth, these weren't instincts at all, but deep-rooted prejudices he had never confronted. During a short break, Dr. Lee watched Dr. Park standing alone by the window. "How are you holding up?" she asked, approaching her friend. "I keep thinking about my patients," Dr. Park replied softly. "I have 3 surgeries scheduled next week. These people have been waiting months for their procedures." "The board stands behind you completely," Dr. Lee assured her. "We all know this case is ridiculous." When court resumed, Judge Kim shuffled his papers and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. Dr. Park stood, her face calm, but her heart racing. "Dr. Michelle Park," Judge Kim began, not looking at her, "this court has reviewed the evidence and testimony presented today. While the patient survived, your actions raised serious concerns about judgment and responsibility." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Dr. Lee's hands tightened into fists in her lap. The evidence had shown exactly the opposite. "Therefore," Judge Kim continued, his voice growing harder, "this court orders the following. First, your medical license will be suspended for 6 months, effective immediately. Second, you will complete 1,000 hours of community service at Hope Street Clinic in the East District." The sentence fell like a hammer in the quiet room. Dr. Park's lawyer jumped to his feet, protesting that the punishment was completely out of proportion to the case. Other doctors in the room began to whisper angrily. Everyone could see what was happening, but no one could say it out loud. Judge Kim's sentence was based on prejudice, not justice. Dr. Park remained standing, her posture straight and dignified. She didn't flinch or cry. She had faced prejudice before in her career, but never with such devastating consequences. "Dr. Park," Judge Kim said, finally looking at her directly, "do you understand the terms of your sentence?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear and steady. I understand completely. Those last two words carried a weight that made Judge Kim shift uncomfortably in his seat. She did understand, not just the sentence, but the prejudice behind it. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Dr. Lee hurried to her friend's side. "We'll appeal this," she said firmly. "This is a complete injustice." Dr. Park gathered her papers slowly. "An appeal could take months," she said. "Meanwhile, my patients would have to wait even longer. No, I'll serve the sentence. But this isn't the end." Later that evening, Dr. Park sat in her office at Central Hospital, preparing notes for the surgeons who would take over her patients. The sunset painted the sky orange outside her window, and the hospital was growing quiet as the day shift ended. A knock on her door made her look up. It was Mr. Sung-Min Choi, the chairman of the hospital board. The elderly man entered slowly, leaning on his cane. "Dr. Park," he said gently, "I wanted to see you before you left. The board met this afternoon after hearing about the verdict." Dr. Park steeled herself for more bad news, but Mr. Choi smiled kindly. "We want you to know that your position here is secured," he said. "6 months will pass quickly, and that clinic could benefit from your expertise, even if this isn't how we would have chosen to share it." Dr. Park felt tears threatening for the first time that day. "Thank you, Mr. Choi." "Sometimes," the old man said thoughtfully, "life takes unexpected turns. But I have learned that these turns often lead us exactly where we need to be, even if we can't see it at the time." As Mr. Choi left, Dr. Park turned back to her window. The city lights were coming on one by one, like stars appearing in the darkening sky. She thought about the small clinic where she would serve her sentence, about the people there who needed help. Judge Kim had meant to punish her, to diminish her, but perhaps she could turn this sentence into something more. She began packing up her office, placing her degrees and certificates carefully in a box. Her hands paused over her surgery schedule book, now filled with crossed-out appointments. Then she straightened her shoulders and continued packing. This was not an ending, she decided. This was just the beginning of a different path. Outside her office, the hospital continued its endless rhythm of saving lives. Soon, she would find a new way to be part of that rhythm. Judge Ha-Joon Kim might think he had written the end of her story today, but Dr. Michelle Park knew better. She had always been good at proving people wrong. Hope Street Clinic sat in a tired-looking building with peeling paint and a squeaky front door. Dr. Michelle Park pushed that door open early on her first Monday morning of community service. The waiting room was already full of people, some coughing, others holding crying children, and a few reading old magazines with wrinkled pages. The clinic's main doctor, Dr. Young-Ho Kang, met her with obvious relief. He was an older man with kind eyes and gray hair who had been running the clinic alone for 15 years. "Thank goodness you're here," he said, leading her through the narrow hallway. "We have 30 patients to see today, and our nurse called in sick." Dr. Park looked around the small examination rooms. The equipment was old but clean. Charts were still kept on paper instead of computers. Everything was organized, but nothing was modern. "Just help where you can," Dr. Kang said. "I know this isn't your usual kind of medicine." Dr. Park rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She might not be allowed to perform surgery, but she could still help people. By lunchtime, she had treated 15 patients, organized the medical supplies, and started teaching the receptionist a better way to schedule appointments. Days at the clinic turned into weeks. Dr. Park learned every patient's name and story. She treated children with fevers, elderly people with arthritis, and workers with injuries. Many patients couldn't afford regular doctors, and the clinic was their only hope for medical care. One morning, a young mother named Mrs. Lee rushed in carrying her 5-year-old son. The boy was having trouble breathing. Dr. Park examined him quickly and recognized the signs of a serious asthma attack. The clinic's old equipment wasn't working well enough to help him. "Call an ambulance," she told the receptionist. Then she turned to Mrs. Lee. "Your son needs hospital care. I'll go with you." At the hospital, Dr. Park ran into her old friend Dr. Ji Woo Lee in the emergency room. "What brings you here?" Dr. Lee asked, surprised. "One of my clinic patients needed emergency care," Dr. Park explained. "The clinic's equipment isn't good enough for serious cases." Dr. Lee watched as Dr. Park comforted Mrs. Lee and explained everything the hospital doctors were doing for her son. "You know," Dr. Lee said thoughtfully, "the hospital has some older equipment we're replacing. Maybe it could go to the clinic instead of being sold." 2 days later, a truck delivered better breathing machines, a modern heart monitor, and other equipment to Hope Street Clinic. Dr. Park spent extra hours teaching the staff how to use everything properly. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Ho-Jun Kim was facing his own crisis. His son, Ta-hyun, had been having terrible headaches for weeks. The 17-year-old boy was a star student and basketball player, but now he could barely get out of bed. "The tests show a rare condition," a doctor explained to Judge Kim. "Your son has a small tumor pressing on his brain. He needs surgery, but it's a very delicate procedure. Only a few surgeons in the state can perform it." Judge Kim felt the floor sway under his feet. "Who are these surgeons?" he asked. The doctor consulted his computer. "Well, Dr. Michelle Park was our top specialist for this type of surgery, but she's currently unavailable. The other 2 surgeons have waiting lists of several months." Judge Kim sat heavily in a chair, remembering the day he had suspended Dr. Park's medical license. Now his own son needed her help, but his actions had made that impossible. Back at Hope Street Clinic, Dr. Park was making big changes. She wrote grant applications to get money for the clinic. She trained the staff in new medical procedures. She even started a program to help patients get cheaper medicine. Word spread about the improvements at the clinic. More patients came, and some local doctors started volunteering their time too. Dr. Park worked longer hours than her community service required, but she didn't mind. She saw how much difference the clinic could make in people's lives. One evening, as she was finishing up paperwork, Dr. Park heard a knock at her office door. She looked up to see Mr. Sung Min Choi, the hospital board chairman, standing there with his cane. "I've been hearing good things about what you're doing here," he said, looking around the much-improved clinic. "You've turned this place around in just a few months." Dr. Park smiled modestly. "The clinic needed help, and I had time to give it." Mr. Choi nodded slowly. "You know, the hospital board has been watching your work here. We're very impressed by your leadership skills." Before Dr. Park could respond, a commotion broke out in the waiting room. A teenage boy had collapsed while waiting to see a doctor. Dr. Park rushed out to help, with Mr. Choi following more slowly. The boy was Ta-hyun Kim, Judge Kim's son. His father stood nearby, looking terrified. Dr. Park didn't hesitate. She knelt beside the unconscious boy and began checking his vital signs. "He needs a hospital right away," she said firmly. "His symptoms are getting worse." Judge Kim stared at Dr. Park, his face pale. This was the doctor he had unfairly punished, now helping his son without a second thought. Shame and fear fought on his face as he watched her take charge of the situation. "Please," he said quietly, "help him." Dr. Park called an ambulance and stayed with Ta-hyun until it arrived. She explained his symptoms to the paramedics and called ahead to the hospital to make sure they were ready for him. As the ambulance drove away, Judge Kim turned to Dr. Park. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Dr. Park replied. "Your son needs help, and that's all that matters right now." Mr. Choi had watched everything from a corner of the waiting room. He saw how Dr. Park handled the emergency, how she put aside any personal feelings to help someone in need, even the son of the man who had tried to destroy her career. Later that night, after the clinic was quiet again, Mr. Choi sat in Dr. Park's office. "I came here today to talk about your future," he said. "The hospital board is planning some changes, and we believe you could play an important role." Dr. Park looked at the old man curiously. "What kind of role?" "Let's just say," Mr. Choi smiled, "that your time here has shown us something very important. You're not just a skilled surgeon. You're a natural leader who can transform an entire medical facility. That's a rare combination. As Mr. Choi left the clinic that night, Dr. Park sat thinking about everything that had happened. Judge Kim's unfair sentence had sent her to this clinic, but instead of ruining her career, it had opened new doors. She had found ways to help people she might never have met otherwise. The next morning, Dr. Park arrived early as usual. The waiting room was already filling up, and Dr. Kang was teaching 2 new volunteer doctors the clinic's procedures Dr. Park had created. She smiled as she hung up her coat. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you could lead to the best changes in your life. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew she was exactly where she needed to be right now. In his hospital bed across town, Ta-hyun Kim was finally getting the care he needed, and his father, Judge Ha-joon Kim, sat beside him, thinking hard about justice, prejudice, and the true meaning of serving others. 2 years passed like turning pages in a book. The Hope Street Clinic had become a model for community healthcare, with modern equipment, trained staff, and a long list of volunteer doctors. Dr. Michelle Park had finished her community service long ago, but she still visited the clinic every week to help Dr. Kang. On a warm spring morning, Mr. Sung Min Choi called a special meeting of the hospital board. The large meeting room was full of doctors, administrators, and important people from the community. Dr. Park sat near the back, wondering why she had been invited. Mr. Choi walked to the front of the room, leaning on his cane. His hair had grown whiter over the past 2 years, but his eyes were still sharp and bright. "My friends," he began, "I have been chairman of this hospital for 25 years. Today, I am announcing my retirement." A surprised murmur ran through the room. Mr. Choi raised his hand for quiet. "But before I go, I want to recommend my successor. This person has shown extraordinary medical skill, leadership ability, and most importantly, a deep understanding of what our community needs." He paused, looking around the room. 2 years ago, this doctor faced unfair treatment that could have ended a brilliant career. Instead, she turned that challenge into an opportunity to help others. She transformed a struggling clinic into a model of community care. She showed us all what true leadership looks like. Dr. Park felt her heart beating faster as Mr. Choi's eyes found her in the crowd. "I recommend Dr. Michelle Park as the new Chief of Medical Operations for Central Hospital." The room erupted in applause. Dr. Ji-woo Lee, sitting next to Dr. Park, grabbed her hand and squeezed it. Many people stood up, clapping and smiling. They had all seen Dr. Park's work over the past 2 years, both at the hospital and the clinic. "The board will vote now," Mr. Choi announced. One by one, the board members voted. The result was unanimous. Dr. Park would become the youngest chief of medical operations in the hospital's history. As people came to congratulate her, Dr. Park noticed someone standing quietly at the back of the room. It was Judge Ha-joon Kim. He had been attending the hospital regularly for his son's treatment, and Dr. Park had made sure Ta-hyun received excellent care, despite her history with his father. Later that afternoon, Dr. Park sat in her new office, looking at the nameplate on the desk. The door opened, and her assistant showed in a visitor, Judge Kim. "Congratulations, Dr. Park," he said, standing awkwardly near the door. "Thank you, Judge Kim," she replied. "Please, sit down. How is Ta-hyun doing?" The judge sat heavily in a chair. "His doctors say he's improving. They tell me it's because of the treatment plan you designed for him." Dr. Park nodded. She had carefully chosen Ta-hyun's medical team and reviewed all his treatment options, even though she still couldn't perform surgery herself at that time. "Dr. Park," Judge Kim said, his voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something. These past 2 years, watching you help my son despite what I did to you, it has changed me. I see now how wrong I was." Dr. Park watched him quietly. The proud judge who had once looked down at her from his bench now sat in her office, humbled by life's strange twists. "I have spent my life thinking I was serving justice," he continued. but I let my prejudices blind me. I caused harm instead of justice. I am deeply sorry." "Judge Kim," Dr. Park replied carefully, "what happened 2 years ago was wrong. But look at what grew from it. The clinic helps hundreds of people every month now. And Taehyun is getting better." The judge nodded slowly. "You turned my unfair punishment into something good. You showed more wisdom than I ever did on the bench." Dr. Park stood and walked to her window. The hospital grounds spread out below, where people came every day seeking help and hope. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "the hospital is starting a new program to address unfair treatment in healthcare. We want to make sure everyone gets the same quality of care, regardless of who they are. Would you be interested in helping with that?" Judge Kim looked surprised. "You would want my help? After everything?" "Sometimes," Dr. Park smiled, remembering Mr. Choi's words from 2 years ago. "The people who have learned the hardest lessons have the most to teach others." The next few weeks were busy ones. Dr. Park moved into her new office and began making changes at the hospital. She started programs to help poor patients get better care. She made sure doctors and nurses got training about treating all patients fairly. And she kept her connection with Hope Street Clinic, which was now a partner with the hospital. Judge Kim, true to his word, began working with the hospital's new fairness program. He spoke to doctors and staff about recognizing and overcoming prejudices. He used his own story as an example of how bias could hurt people and how important it was to change. One day, Dr. Park was reviewing hospital records when she found something interesting. Since starting their new programs, the hospital had better results with all patients. People were getting well faster. More people were coming for help before their problems got too serious. The changes were working. She looked up as her assistant brought in more files. On top was a newspaper article about the hospital's improvements. The headline read, "Local Hospital Leads the Way in Fair Healthcare." Dr. Park smiled as she read it. The article mentioned how she had gone from being unfairly punished to leading the hospital. It talked about the changes at Hope Street Clinic and the new programs helping people get better care. Near her desk stood a small frame. Inside was her old community service order from Judge Kim. She kept it there to remind herself that good things could come from bad situations if you stayed strong and kept helping others. Outside her window, she could see the hospital's new sign. Central Hospital, quality care for all. Below it, patients and families walked in and out, all getting the care they needed, no matter who they were. The phone on her desk buzzed. "Dr. Park," her assistant said, "Judge Kim is here with some volunteers for the Fairness Training Program." "Send them in," Dr. Park replied. She stood up, ready to help more people learn the lessons that had changed both her life and Judge Kim's. This was what real justice looked like, she thought. Not punishment, but change. Not anger, but growth. Not division, but coming together to help everyone. As Judge Kim walked in with the volunteers, Dr. Park saw in his eyes that he understood this too. They had both learned that true power wasn't about controlling others, but about helping them. And that was a lesson worth sharing with everyone. The city's biggest medical conference was being held at Central Hospital, and Dr. Michelle Park stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces. 3 years had passed since she became chief of medical operations, and the hospital had grown into something special under her leadership. Today, she began, "We're not just talking about medicine. We're talking about changing lives." Her voice carried clearly through the large room. In the front row, she saw Judge Ho-Joon Kim sitting next to his son, Taehyun, who was now healthy and in college. Dr. Park clicked to her first presentation slide, showing pictures of Hope Street Clinic, both old and new. 3 years ago, this small clinic was struggling to help people. Today, it's one of 5 community clinics that work with our hospital. Together, we help thousands of people who couldn't get good medical care before. She showed more slides about the hospital's new programs. There were pictures of doctors teaching in community centers, nurses giving free checkups in schools, and medical students learning about treating all patients fairly. But numbers and pictures don't tell the whole story, Dr. Park continued. The real story is about people changing how they think and act. It's about learning to see past our first judgments and treat everyone with respect. In the audience, Judge Kim nodded slowly. He remembered how his own prejudices had almost ruined Dr. Park's career. Now he spent much of his time teaching other judges about fairness, using his own story as an example of how bias could hurt people. Dr. Park clicked to her next slide, showing the hospital's improved patient recovery rates. When we treat all patients with equal care and respect, everyone gets better results. This isn't just about being nice. It's about saving lives. After her speech, many people came to talk to Dr. Park. Some wanted to start similar programs at their hospitals. Others wanted to volunteer at the community clinics. Young medical students asked her advice about becoming better doctors. Later that afternoon, Dr. Park sat in her office with Dr. Ji-Woo Lee, who was now running a special training program for new doctors. They were looking at plans for a new community clinic when someone knocked on the door. It was Ta-hyun Kim, Judge Kim's son. He wasn't a sick teenager anymore, but a tall, healthy young man wearing a college sweatshirt. "Dr. Park," he said, smiling, "I wanted to tell you something. I've decided to go to medical school. Watching you and the other doctors help people, it made me want to do the same thing." Dr. Park smiled warmly. "That's wonderful news, Ta-hyun. Your father must be proud." "He is," Ta-hyun nodded. "He's different now, you know. He talks to his law students about justice and fairness in new ways. He tells them about you and what he learned." After Ta-hyun left, Dr. Park walked through the hospital halls. She passed the new children's wing, where bright paintings made young patients smile. She saw doctors and nurses from many different backgrounds working together. In the waiting rooms, she noticed how staff members treated everyone with the same care and respect. Near the hospital entrance, she stopped to look at a wall of photographs. It showed the hospital's history, from its early days to the present. Her eyes found a new picture. It showed her and Judge Kim cutting the ribbon at the opening of the latest community clinic. "Quite a change from that day in court, isn't it?" a voice said behind her. It was Judge Kim. Dr. Park turned to face him. "Life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn," she replied. "I've been thinking," Judge Kim said, "about starting a program to help judges and doctors work together. So many court cases involve medical issues, but we don't always understand each other's work." "That's an excellent idea," Dr. Park said. "Would you like to discuss it over coffee?" They walked to the hospital cafe, talking about their new project. Other people in the cafe watched them with interest. The judge and the doctor, once on opposite sides, now working together to help others. That evening, Dr. Park had a special dinner meeting with hospital staff and community leaders. They were gathered to celebrate the success of their programs and plan for the future. Mr. Sung-min Choi, now retired but still active in hospital projects, stood up to speak. "When I chose Dr. Park as my successor," he said, smiling, "some people thought I was taking a risk. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that someone who could turn unfair treatment into positive change would be exactly the leader we needed." Later, as the dinner was ending, a young doctor approached Dr. Park. "I heard about what happened to you years ago," she said. "It must have been hard not to be angry." Dr. Park thought carefully before answering. "Anger is easy," she said. "Change is harder, but change helps more people in the end." The next morning, Dr. Park arrived early at her office. On her desk was a letter from another hospital asking for help starting similar programs. Next to it was a note from Ta-hyun, thanking her for inspiring his choice to become a doctor. She looked out her window at the sunrise. The hospital was quiet now, but soon it would be full of people, patients seeking help, doctors and nurses providing care, students learning to be better healers, and community members working together. Judge Kim had shown that people could learn from their mistakes and change their ways of thinking. The hospital had shown that treating everyone fairly led to better results for all. And Dr. Park had shown that sometimes life's worst moments could lead to its best opportunities. On her wall hung a simple frame containing the words of the unfair sentence from years ago. Below it was a new plaque naming her Healthcare Leader of the Year. The contrast between these two items told a story of transformation, not just for her and Judge Kim, but for an entire community. Dr. Park opened her computer to start the day's work. There were always more people to help, more programs to create, more changes to make. But now she had partners in this work: doctors, nurses, community leaders, and yes, even judges, all working together to build something better than before. Outside her office, the hospital came alive as a new day began. In the lobby, a sign displayed the hospital's motto: healing together, growing together. It was more than just words on a wall. It was the story of how unfairness had led to understanding, how punishment had led to partnership, and how two people's journey had helped an entire community learn to be better. As Dr. Park reviewed the day's schedule, she smiled at how far they had all come. Sometimes the path to justice wasn't straight. Sometimes it took unexpected turns. But if you stayed true to helping others, even the hardest journey could lead to a better place for everyone.